We're here, as Jerry was saying, because there's this proposal to build a really colossal new part of this extraordinary city. There's some skepticism as to whether it will kind of match the quality and daring of what has been built here in the past. But rather than sort of lament that fact, we want to try and be constructive and positive about what could happen. So I came to this thinking, well, what positive models can I show? And other people are going to show examples from other European cities outside Britain. So I'm not going to do that. But I wanted to start by making a very simple point, which is that Britain has an extraordinary tradition of town planning, of constructing large chunks of city, sometimes quite quickly, in a way that is intelligent, that is innovative, that sets a model for other places all over the world. And yet somehow that has been forgotten. So planning is not rabies. There's a kind of assumption that planning is a kind of dangerous foreign idea that has to be kind of kept in quarantine if it shows any sign of crossing the channel into this country. And that's just plain wrong. So I'm quickly going to run through some sort of great examples from the last 3 centuries, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's good about them. This is Edinburgh New Town from the 18th century, Robert Adam and his relatives. Basically a formal layout of streets and squares, which also runs through from the thinking runs from the kind of macro scale of how you lay out a very big piece of a city to the railings, the pavements, the details of the windows, the relationship of kind of buildings to trees and nature. Centre of Newcastle, more the work of kind of many hands, but still with a sort of overall intention that allows a kind of degree of diversity while still having a sense of the whole. Bazalgette, London, a response to the effects of cholera, the discovery that cholera was a waterborne disease, a discovery which was greatly resisted by water companies who didn't want the responsibility for doing something about it. The Great Stink, which was when the Thames was so full of sewage, combined with a very hot summer, caused the Houses of Parliament to close, which finally led to something being done about it. And then an absolutely unbelievable project to not only supply the whole of London with adequate sewerage, but to completely change the nature of the river, to create a completely new way of experiencing the kind of boundary between the city and the water, the creation of the embankments on both sides of the Thames, complete with street furniture, pieces of architecture, monuments, and then all the way out to places like Abbey Mills, where some astonishing structures were built for the purpose of handling all the sewage that ended up there. The Boundary Estate in Shoreditch, built on one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious, slums of 19th century London. The decision was finally made to clear these slums and to build sort of salubrious new dwellings, and in so doing created one of the very first examples of social housing in the world, which is then followed worldwide. And here again, there's a sense of the whole. There's a kind of integrity to the whole development. There's a consistency of detail, but there's also an ability for this kind of overall vision to come down to quite small details, quite human scale, and also there's an idea about what is the public realm within that. So this photograph is actually taken from, there's a mound in the middle of the Boundary Estate, which was formed by the rubble from destroying all the slums that were cleared. So it's a big pile of bricks and God knows what. And then they planted trees on it, they put a bandstand in the middle. It's a kind of rather wonderful little urban moment. So there's a kind of intelligence running through the whole thing. Letchworth, the Garden City movement, again another model that was kind of invented in Britain that was exported all over the world. An idea about living among nature, or a kind of version of nature, escaping the unhealthy city, but also, kind of importantly, the garden cities are not actually sort of sprawl, they're actually quite relatively high density, and they're not just housing estates. There's an idea about making a community there. This is Roehampton, the Alton estate, a kind of combination of Le Corbusier's idea of blocks of housing amid greenery with the English garden city tradition, extraordinarily bold and mostly successful, even though it's sort of this kind of form of architecture went out of fashion. And that's the Alton estate again. And then the Barbican in London, kind of sometimes an object of derision and sort of satire, but it's actually pretty great. It creates these sort of oases in the middle of London. The architecture is pretty has a kind of consistency to it. There's something impressive about it. Importantly, the only people who live in the Barbican want to live there. It's you have to buy a flat there. So it's not a case of forcing people to live in a sort of utopia that somebody else has dreamt up. It's a matter of choice. So there is this tradition from at least the 18th century until the 1970s of taking big areas of land and saying we're going to build a new piece of city there, and we're going to bring to that new ideas about what a city could be, which then plays out both in the overall architectural plan, whether it's something quite geometric like in Edinburgh New Town, or it's sort of more picturesque, if you like, as in the garden cities. There are ideas about how people live in relation to nature or water, and then it's followed through all the way to the kind of architectural details, and the way the pavements, the railings, the windows, but not necessarily, and usually not in a way that is sort of oppressive. I mean, there can be something wrong with over design. There can be a problem with developments where everything is so minutely prescribed in advance that there's no opportunity for the people who live there to make any decisions whatsoever about what they want to add to it. But you have examples like this, where there's a kind of overall form, idea that allows kind of invention within it. Also importantly, what I've just shown are examples of many different kinds of agency or client or institution creating them. Some of them are private developers, basically speculative builders, like Peel Holdings. Some of them are public authorities, and it's not really about public against private, state against business. There are different ways of achieving these things, no matter where they come from. And some of these things are designed purely for profit. Some are like Boundary Estate, represent a kind of social ideal. So really, and also most of what I've shown you was pioneering, and as I say, has kind of set patterns that have been followed in other countries. So kind of why does it have to stop now? And as I said, I could talk for 20 minutes or hours about all the places in Britain in the last 15, 20 years which are of a comparable scale to the works I've just shown you, but where that sort of thinking does not apply. And they're quite often near water. They're particularly often near water. And it's a bit strange because when Tony Blair came to power, he was friends with Richard Rogers, and as a result of that, something called the Urban Task Force was created. And there was a kind of idea, a sort of publicly stated idea, that the New Labour were going to take the urban environment, architecture, design more seriously than had ever happened before, or certainly had happened for a long time. They renamed the Department of National Heritage the Department of Culture to sort of stress the point that they were now going to be forward-looking and that they weren't just looking at the past. And the Urban Task Force produced a document called Towards an Urban Renaissance, which set out various principles which in theory were then followed. And one of the central to it was Rogers' idea of the compact city, which is that rather than seeing urban density as a bad thing, it's a good thing, because if you have a lot of people living in the same place, they support each other, they kind of create communities, they sustain shared services, they sustain shared shops, businesses, restaurants, public transport. But a crucial part of the Rogers concept was what's called good design, because if you get people to live in close proximity, if you build at high densities, the completely correct idea is that therefore you have to be a bit more careful about the way you construct the shared spaces, the way you create environments that everybody can live in happily together. So that theory is bang on, and the big example that Rogers kept talking about was Barcelona, for example. But somehow that has hardly happened at all. We've got the high density, we've got the more and more apartments being built in the middle of cities, but it's extraordinarily hard to find really the complete fulfillment of this sort of dream. What I have here is an image, part of an image that was recently published in the Evening Standard in London. It's a picture of the south side of the Thames, as it will be, and this is a kind of pretty direct consequence of this theory of densification. It's on water, as you will see, and it's a really very similar kind of phenomenon in some ways, apart from the fact we're talking about different ownerships here, to Liverpool waters. And really you can find the same thing again and again in pretty much every big city in Britain, whether there's water there or not. And what this is a picture of is towers that are consented or on the way or under construction, and most of what's in that picture is not there yet but will be, and it's a kind of strange sort of hodgepodge of different kind of architectural ideas that really doesn't seem to have any, where the individual buildings have almost nothing to do with each other, and they have even less to do with whatever was there in the first place before they came along. And they sort of go out of their way to be assertive. I mean, particularly something like this. Sorry, this tower here. This here is the Shell building, which, when it was built in the 1960s, was seen as an absolutely outrageous imposition on the skyline of London. But as you can see, it's almost disappearing behind buildings that are considerably bigger. And then this is further upstream. This is essentially Vauxhall. Sorry, I'm trying to find, here we are. Okay, this is St George's Wharf, which has been there for a while. This is a building which at least twice has won a poll among architects in the Architects' Journal. Architects were asked to name their worst building in the world, and they named this development. This, however, has not stopped this tower getting consent and is now nearly complete by exactly the same architects and the same developers. This was actually the subject of a public inquiry, and the inspector in the public inquiry found against it. Sorry, Jerry, how am I doing for time? Shall I shut up? Where are you going? Okay. So they had a public inquiry. The public inquiry found against it. They said it was kind of just the wrong building in the wrong place. But John Prescott, who was the relevant minister at the time, used the power that he has to simply ignore that. And he said, well, you've got to build it anyway. And there was a Freedom of Information request was made, which unearthed some wonderful correspondence with the civil servants and John Prescott. And the civil servants saying, well, you really should not do this. You have the power to do it, but you should not use that power. And Prescott just said, well, no, I'm going to do it. And so then the civil servants have to start saying, well, if you are going to approve it, then this is the way you should present it, and this is the way you should describe it. Anyway, so this building, this extremely controversial building, having been approved, it's now kind of opened the gates for this building, which is even bigger. And I can see no sense in these images of, what's the big idea? What's the kind of collective idea of the city? What are these things supposed to do in combination with each other? It's simply a case of building as big as you can get away with and putting a bit of kind of architectural styling on top. And it's a pretty similar thing to what's happening at Liverpool Waters. And combined with that, and in the Urban Task Force report, and in almost any sort of statement about what good urbanism is that anybody has made in the last 20 to 30 years, there's this idea that the ground level is incredibly important, that buildings are not just objects on their own. It's about how they work together to create public realm at their base. And bang on, absolutely right. Buildings do not act on their own. But you really can't see that. This is Strata SE1, another tower built in Elephant and Castle in London, and I can just see no sort of thought or intelligence to how the base of this building might relate to anything that's already there or anything that might happen there in the future. And what usually happens is that they get permission to build a tower and they promise to sort of spend some money on the kind of paving and reorganising the traffic at ground level. So that has happened. So what you see in this picture is a kind of new road layout and some new paving paid for by the developers of Strata SE1. But that's not really the same as creating a new urban space. And this is the foot of the Vauxhall Tower, now called St George's Tower, which I showed you previous. This is the one John Prescott approved against the advice of his civil servants. And again, you can see no idea whatsoever about what kind of a place is it making at ground level. In the right of this picture, you see earlier buildings by the same architects. This is in fact St George's Wharf, this worst building in the world, according to the Architects Journal poll. And so we have the same architects, the same developers, but I can see no meaningful relationship between these buildings, even though they're from the same people. And I can't even see a meaningful relationship between the ground floor, first floor, and second to 40th floor of the Vauxhall Tower. I mean, it's just, there seems to be, from here to here to here, it just changes its mind about what it is. So simply this idea of how you relate the different scales, the different parts of a building, different buildings to each other, just seems to be not there. This is actually another. I think this is also Broadway Mallion and St George's, who are the same developer architect combination who did Vauxhall Tower. This is Imperial Wharf, another of these kind of riverside developments. Again, you have sort of shoddy architecture. You have a kind of very sketchy idea of what the public realm is. It's about putting in sort of Chinese granite pavements, a bit of shrubbery, some light fittings, but there's no idea of wholeness. What's unusual about here is that a company called Rocker, who make sort of luxury bathrooms, hired Zaha Hadid to design a showroom, an unbelievably expensive showroom for their bathroom. So the kind of middle layer of this image is a Zaha Hadid facade. Extraordinarily expensive, extraordinary investment of some sort of architectural energy. The employment of a quote unquote world-class architect who's sort of garlanded with honours, but which really just adds to the cacophony of the space. So it's a complete misdirection, bad investment of architectural talent and if you like, constructional expense. You build a basically shoddy environment, and then you try and make up for it with a sort of supposed work of genius, which doesn't really work. Okay, finally, I'm just going to show an image, and I think Michael's going to talk about this more, of Borneo Sporenburg in Amsterdam. This is a former dock area, which was, I think, first planned about 20 years ago. And this is high density. It's a very similar situation to Liverpool Waters in a way. Old docks, lots of empty space, water. You want to put a lot of housing there. You want high densities. And here it was all achieved. And although the buildings are quite low, there's very high densities there. But it was very well thought out. It allows, if you look at this image, you can see that there's a lot of distinctiveness, individual buildings to do with the way in which individual house owners were allowed to build their own thing within a kind of overall framework. If you look here, there's a kind of big building in the middle of it, big apartment building. There are some quite nice bridges. It's a sort of great place to live. It's a very successful community. It's a very well-known model in the kind of architecture and planning business. The Urban Task Force loved it. Everybody agrees it's fantastically successful. A model that should be followed in the same way that the Boundary Estate was a model that was followed in its time. But you can't really find anything like it in Britain. So everyone says we should do something like this, they haven't. So why has that not happened? Is it because Dutch are richer than us? No, they're not. Is it because the Dutch have better architects than us? Not really. There's very good architects in Britain. I think this is a subject for further conversation, but it's basically to do with the kind of political structure and the relationship of public authorities to business and their relative power. But I'm going to leave it at that and come back to it when we have our discussion. Thank you.